From Miniville's Festivus event, I'm joined now by Peter Schiff of Euro Pacific Capital and Gary Shilling of A. Gary Shilling & Company, author of The Age of Deleveraging and several books about deflation. Peter, I don't know if you've read any of Gary's books, but he's very concerned about deflation. I know you're very worried about inflation. What is he missing?
He's missing a lot. I think, he's not focusing on the dollar, on our current account and our trade deficits, on our lack of savings and production. And what ultimately happens when you have an economic collapse in a nation like us, if you look throughout history and look at other countries that have gotten in these predicaments, only not as large a scale as us, you've always had an inflationary collapse. And I think that's what's coming. That's what commodity prices are telling us. That's what today's 30-year high in silver is telling us, a new all-time high in gold stocks today, a 2-year high in oil. Money is losing value, not only the dollar, but other currencies, but I think particularly the dollar. And you've got a madman at the Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke. We're running these massive deficits. We're monetizing them. We're calling it quantitative easing, but let's call it what it is. Right. I mean, that's inflation. I mean, that's what happened.
Right. So how do you account for these big increases in commodity prices that Peter just mentioned?
Well, it's interesting. Everybody blames it on the Fed, but the Fed does not create money. The Fed creates reserves. It's up to the banks and the lenders, and the borrowers, rather, to turn reserves into money. And I'm not sure why the dollar's been weak and commodities been run up, but I think a lot of it is anticipatory. It's assumption that all those reserves, and you now got over $1 trillion in excess
they're going to find their way into the economy.
Somehow are going to be lent and borrowed and turned into money. But that isn't happening so far.
Well,
and that was QE1, and now the Fed has got QE2 with another $600 billion net, and I think it's probably going to be more of the same. But at some point, I think reality will set in. But right now, I don't think there's any substantial reason for the weakness in the dollar or the run-up in commodity prices.
There are a lot of reasons, but the big reality is going to be, we have all this debt, right? We can't possibly pay it back, so all we can do is print. I mean, unless you think the U.S. government is going to default, which is certainly an option, that we're going to default on our Treasury debt.
But look at that government debt. If you look at government debt relative to GDP, since the first quarter of 2006, it has gone from 3% of GDP to 10%.
That's a
big jump. Okay, but then you look at what's happened in the private sector. Their borrowing in relation to GDP has gone in that same time from 13% to minus 5%.
What does that have to do?
It's going down 18
but what does that have
points.
To do?
Oh, wait a minute, hear me out. It's going down 18 percentage points. While the government borrowing is going up 7, less than half. In other words, deleveraging is going on.
I think what Gary's saying is that the private sector deleveraging is offsetting what the government is doing on the inflation on the other side.
More than offsetting.
But what does that have to do with the government's ability to repay its debts or to service its debts? I mean, right now we have a $14 trillion national debt.
The government's ability to repay its debt depends on the holders, and the reality is that we are the safe haven.
No, we're not.
Look at the euro, for goodness sakes. The euro virtually collapsed this spring. It's now under fire. It was Greece earlier. Now it's Ireland. It's the rest of the pigs, Portugal, Spain.
Yeah, but we're a bigger pig than all of them combined.
China is trying to calm down that economy, and that's a stop-go economy, and they're probably going to have a hard landing.
What do you think is going to happen when interest rates rise, and all of a sudden...
Why would interest rates rise?
They're rising right now. Look at the yields. We hit a 4 or 5 month high today in yields.
I mean, we're still at 3% though on the 10-year.
Right.
But what happens? What if it's 5% next year, and then the year after that? What if it goes even higher?
What if the dog jumps over the fence?
I'm talking about some things that are probable. I'm not talking about.
That's your opinion.
But what happens?
My opinion is that we're going to 2% on the 10-year and 3% on the 30-year.
You're familiar
with? I've been forecasting declines in interest rates, as Aaron's know, ever since the 30-year was 15.25% in 1981. Now maybe I'm dead wrong this time, but I'll tell you, all the way down. The only exception was at the end of 08.
Let me ask you a question.
The end of 08, when you had irrational exuberance in treasuries, but every time guys like you have said, you can't go lower, you can't go lower, you can't go lower, and that's what's happening.
And if you end up holding those treasuries long enough, you're going to go down with that ship. Because my point was, when interest rates rise, and you have to admit they could rise, right? I mean, Murphy's Law, anything that can go wrong will. Let's say rates rise, and all of a sudden the federal government needs $1 trillion a year, $1.5 trillion a year, just to pay the interest on the national debt, let alone any of the retiring principal. How are they going to get that money in a recession? Because if rates rise, we'll be back in a recession, the banks will be failing, housing prices will be plunging. How can we put...
Anything can happen. All I can say is that I think we are in the age of deleveraging. That's the title of my book, and as long as it's selling well and it's #1 in Amazon's bestsellers on investment books, that's my forecast. Beyond that, you're on your own.
But the government is borrowing like never
Wait.
before. People are still using credit cards. They're still borrowing money.
No,
they're
they're not. They're
loans,
paying
they're
down
taking
their
out
credit
home-
cards. Look at the data. The credit card borrowing, which is called revolving credit, is dropping like a rock. Consumers are paying
Consumers
down
are
mortgages.
deleveraging, right?
Which consumers?
U.S. consumers.
Well, then how are they buying all these Christmas shots?
at the
What about
data.
we had a record Black Friday and Cyber Monday? Where's all that money coming from? Because they don't have any savings.